I never asked to be born. That's what my parents, Robert and Linda Parker, made crystal clear from day one. I'm Cindy, the unwanted second child, the afterthought, the burden. My sister Melissa? She's the golden child, the one they actually planned for. Growing up in the Parker household was like living in two different worlds. Melissa's world was full of love, attention, and celebration. My world? Cold indifference and barely concealed resentment. I remember my 8th birthday like it was yesterday. I woke up excited, hoping this year would be different. Maybe they'd remember. Maybe they'd care. I came downstairs to find Mom and Dad at the breakfast table, chatting with Melissa about her upcoming dance recital. Morning, I said, trying to keep the hope out of my voice. Mom glanced up. Oh, Cindy. Your cereal's in the cupboard. I waited, but that was it. No happy birthday, no hug, nothing. Later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, Dad finally remembered. Oh, right. Happy birthday, kid, he muttered, not even looking up from his plate. Mom's eyes widened slightly. Is that today? I could have sworn it was next week. That night, I lay in bed, clutching the one birthday card I'd received, from Grandma Elizabeth. Her words were the only ones that made me feel like I mattered. My dearest Cindy, happy birthday, sweetheart. You bring so much joy to my life. Never forget how special and loved you are. Love always, Grandma. I must have read that card 100 times, trying to believe the words. But how could I be special when my own parents could barely remember I existed? School wasn't much better. Parent-teacher conferences were a joke. I'd watch as other kids' parents showed up, proud and interested. Mine? They always had an excuse. Sorry, Cindy, Mom would say, not sounding sorry at all. We've got Melissa's dance competition that day. You understand, right? I'd nod, pretending it didn't hurt. But it did. Every single time. The worst part was overhearing them talk about me when they thought I couldn't hear. One night, I was supposedly in bed when their voices drifted up the stairs. I just don't get it, Dad was saying. Melissa's so bright and talented. Why can't Cindy be more like her? Mom sighed. I know. It's like she doesn't even try. Remember how Melissa was reading at 4? Cindy could barely tie her shoes at that age. Their words cut deep, each one a reminder that I'd never be good enough, never be wanted. As I grew older, the emotional chasm between us only widened. I became quieter, withdrawn. Why bother trying when nothing I did would ever measure up? But there was one person who saw me, really saw me. Grandma Elizabeth. Every visit to her tiny house was like stepping into a different world. A world where I was loved, where my opinions mattered, where I could just be me. At 12, I finally reached my breaking point. The toxic atmosphere at home had become unbearable, and I knew I had to make a change or risk losing myself entirely. With tears streaming down my face, I approached Grandma. Grandma, I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper, can I come live with you instead? I held my breath, terrified she might say no. But Elizabeth's response was immediate and filled with warmth. Oh, sweetheart, she said, pulling me into a tight hug, you'll always have a home with me. And one day, everything I have will be yours. I melted into her embrace, feeling truly safe for the first time in years. I didn't care about inheriting anything, all I wanted was to feel loved and accepted. When my parents heard about this arrangement, their reaction was exactly what I'd come to expect. They laughed. Mom's place? Dad scoffed. That tiny old house? And she works at the library for peanuts. What could she possibly offer you, Cindy? Mom just shrugged, a look of relief crossing her face. Well, if that's what you want. It'll certainly make things easier around here. Their casual dismissal hurt, but it also confirmed I was making the right choice. They saw no value in what Grandma could offer me, but they were more than happy to be relieved of their parental responsibilities. Life with Elizabeth wasn't easy. Money was tight, and we often struggled to make ends meet. Grandma worked long hours at the library, and I started doing odd jobs to help out. But none of that mattered because, for the first time, I felt truly loved and accepted. Grandma never missed a school event. She'd sit front and center at every presentation, every award ceremony, beaming with pride. My artwork covered her fridge, and she'd brag about her brilliant granddaughter to anyone who would listen. Under Grandma's care, I began to thrive. The quiet, withdrawn girl I'd been started to fade away. I made friends, joined clubs, and my grades improved dramatically. It was amazing what a little encouragement and support could do. Yes, we might have been struggling financially. There were nights when I'd catch Grandma skipping dinner, claiming she wasn't hungry so I could have a full plate. But even in those tough times, the warmth and affection in our tiny home made up for any material lack. Everything changed on a crisp autumn afternoon when Grandma came home with an expression I'd never seen before, a bewildering mix of joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. "Cindy, sweetheart," she said, her voice quavering, "we need to talk. It's about my sister, Margaret. She passed away unexpectedly." I vaguely remembered hearing about Aunt Margaret, a wealthy businesswoman who'd been estranged from the family for years. "I'm so sorry, Grandma," I said, reaching for her hand. She squeezed it, then continued, "There's more, Cindy. Margaret, she left me everything. Her entire fortune. We're millionaires now, sweetheart. Multimillionaires." As news of Grandma's windfall spread, it didn't take long for my parents to come knocking. One evening, there was a tentative knock at our door. When Grandma opened it, there stood Robert and Linda, all smiles and teary eyes. "Elizabeth, Cindy," Mom said, her voice choked with emotion I'd never heard before. We've made a terrible mistake." Dad nodded, looking more humble than I'd ever seen him. "We've been awful parents. Truly awful. But we've realized our errors, and we want to make things right." I stood frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. These people, who had ignored and belittled me for years, were now begging for a second chance. "Please, Cindy," Mom pleaded, reaching out to me. "Come home, let us be the family we should have been all along." I looked to Grandma, confused and conflicted. She gave me a small smile. "It's your decision, sweetheart. Whatever you choose, I'll support you." After days of agonizing, I decided to give them another chance. With Grandma's blessing, I packed my bags and returned to the Parker house. At first, it seemed like a dream come true. Mom and Dad were attentive, loving even. They attended every school event, cheering louder than anyone else. They bought me gifts, not expensive ones, but thoughtful presents that showed they were finally paying attention to who I was. Family game nights became a regular thing. I remember the first time Dad ruffled my hair after I won at Monopoly, saying, "That's my girl." The warmth that spread through me was indescribable. The biggest shock came at bedtime. Mom started tucking me in every night, just like I'd always wanted as a little girl. She'd smooth my hair back and plant a soft kiss on my forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," she'd whisper. "We love you so much." Even Melissa seemed to have had a change of heart. She started including me in her social activities, introduced me to her friends, and even gave me advice about boys and makeup. I wanted to believe it was all real. That my family had truly changed, that they finally saw me and loved me for who I was. But a small voice in the back of my mind kept whispering doubts. Why now? Why only after Grandma came into money? I pushed those thoughts aside, determined to enjoy this new, loving family dynamic I'd always dreamed of. I called Grandma regularly, gushing about how happy I was and how wonderful everything had become. But Grandma, while expressing joy for me, couldn't quite hide the concern in her voice. "Just remember, Cindy," she'd say, "you always have a home with me, no matter what." Life in the Parker household settled into a new rhythm as the months rolled by. Melissa, ever the golden child, graduated high school with honors and headed off to a prestigious college. Meanwhile, Grandma moved into a luxurious new home and bid farewell to her days at the library. As for me? Well, I was 16 now, and things were looking up. My grades were better than ever, I had a solid group of friends, and I'd even started dating. Jake from my chemistry class had asked me out, and I was over the moon. It was a Friday evening, and I had plans to meet Jake at the local diner. I'd spent hours getting ready, nervously changing outfits and redoing my makeup. I headed out, excited for my date. But as I sat at the diner, waiting for Jake, my phone buzzed with a text. "Sorry, Cindy. Something came up. Can't make it tonight." My heart sank. I stared at the message, disappointment washing over me. With a sigh, I gathered my things and left the diner, heading back home much earlier than I'd planned. The house was quiet as I let myself in, using my key to avoid disturbing anyone. Mom and Dad thought I was still out on my date, and I wasn't in the mood to explain why I was back so early. As I passed by Dad's study, I heard voices. I was about to announce my presence when Mom's words stopped me cold. "I don't know how much longer I can keep up this charade," Mom said, frustration evident in her voice. "I never wanted her in the first place, and pretending to love her now is exhausting." I froze, my blood turning to ice. Pretending to love me? My mind reeled, unable to process what I was hearing. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and hit record. I knew I shouldn't be eavesdropping, but I couldn't stop myself. Dad's response made my stomach churn. "We need to be patient, dear. Once Mom passes, all that money will go to Cindy. If we play our cards right, we can convince her to share the wealth with us. Just think of the life we could have." I stood there, rooted to the spot, as my world crumbled around me. The loving family I thought I'd finally found was nothing but a lie. A performance put on for the sake of Grandma's money. Tears welled up in my eyes as the truth sank in. All those family game nights, the bedtime kisses, the proud smiles at my achievements, it was all fake. Every moment of love and acceptance I'd treasured over the past months was nothing but a calculated act. When I couldn't bear to listen anymore, I quietly retraced my steps to the front door. Taking a deep breath to compose myself, I opened the door loudly and slammed it shut. "I'm home," I called out, my voice surprisingly steady. Almost instantly, Mom and Dad emerged from the study, all smiles and concern. "Cindy, sweetie, you're back early," Mom said, her brow furrowed with what I now knew was fake worry. "Everything okay?" Dad added, his tone dripping with false concern. I fought back the urge to scream at them, to call them out on their lies right then and there. Instead, I plastered on a weak smile. "Jake canceled," I mumbled, watching their faces closely. Something came up, apparently. Their reactions were perfect, too perfect. Mom's sympathetic clack, Dad's reassuring pat on my shoulder. It was all I could do not to flinch away from their touch. That night, I lay awake for hours, their words echoing in my head. By morning, my mind was made up. I waited until I heard both cars pull out of the driveway, then sprang into action. I packed my bags quickly, shoving clothes and precious mementos into my duffel bag. Without a backward glance, I left the house that had never truly been my home and made my way to Elizabeth's. When I showed up on her doorstep, bags in hand, Grandma's eyes widened in shock. "Cindy, what's wrong, sweetheart?" I burst into tears, the emotions I'd been holding back finally breaking free. Between sobs, I managed to pull out my phone and play the recording. Grandma's face transformed as she listened. Shock gave way to disbelief, then to a fury I'd never seen before. Those conniving, heartless, she cut herself off, taking a deep breath. Her eyes softened as she looked at me. "Don't worry, honey. We'll give them a surprise they won't forget." She pulled me into a fierce hug, and for the first time since overhearing that conversation, I felt safe. As evening fell, my phone began to buzz incessantly. Mom, Dad, even Melissa, all calling, leaving voicemails, sending texts. I ignored them all until finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Hello?" I answered, my voice cold. "Cindy, Oh, thank God, Mom's voice came through, sounding frantic. Where are you? We'd been so worried. I almost laughed at the irony. I'm with Grandma, I replied calmly. And we'd like to invite you all over for a family conversation tomorrow. There was a pause on the other end. Of course, Mom stammered. We'll be there, Cindy, honey, whatever's wrong, we can fix it. I hung up before she could finish. Fix it? They had no idea what was coming. The following evening, the air was thick with tension. When the doorbell rang, Grandma gave my hand a reassuring squeeze before going to answer it. My parents stepped into the mansion, their faces masks of concern and affection. It made my stomach turn to see how easily they could switch on their act. Cindy, sweetheart, Mom started, reaching out to me. I took a step back, and confusion flashed across her face. Grandma's voice was cool as she gestured to the dining room. Please, have a seat. We have much to discuss. As they settled into their chairs, Dad's eyes darted around the room, no doubt taking in the obvious signs of wealth. Mom, what's this all about? Is everything okay? Without a word, I placed my phone on the table and hit play. The room filled with the sound of their own voices, discussing their scheme in cold, calculating tones. The effect was immediate. The color drained from their faces, leaving them ashen and wide-eyed. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, while Dad seemed to shrink in his chair. When it finished, there was a moment of deafening silence. Then, they both started talking at once, a jumble of excuses and apologies that rang hollow in the face of their exposed deceit. Grandma raised her hand, silencing them. Her voice, when she spoke, trembled with a mixture of disappointment and barely contained fury. I had hoped, I truly believed you had changed, she said, each word heavy with emotion. I was even considering dividing my estate among all of you. She paused, fixing them with a steely gaze. But now, I can say with absolute certainty that everything I have will go to Cindy alone. The realization of what they'd lost, not just their scheme, but the genuine opportunity to be part of a wealthy family, seemed to hit my parents all at once. Panic set in, and their reactions whiplashed from one extreme to another. Please, you have to understand, Mom pleaded, tears streaming down her face. We made a mistake, but we do love Cindy. We can make this right. But when their begging fell on deaf ears, their tone quickly changed. Dad's face contorted with anger. You can't do this. We're her parents. We have rights. We'll make sure you never see her again, Elizabeth. Their threats washed over me, but I felt oddly calm. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I stood and what I needed to do. I'm filing for emancipation, I announced, my voice steady and clear. Grandma will be my legal guardian. You don't have any power over me anymore. The shock on their faces would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so painful. They looked from me to Grandma, seemingly unable to process that their carefully laid plans had not only failed, but backfired spectacularly. I think it's time for you to leave, Grandma said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She stood, gesturing towards the door. When the door closed behind them, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Grandma enveloped me in a warm embrace, and I felt the tension of the past few days start to melt away. The weeks following the confrontation with my parents were a whirlwind of legal meetings and court appearances. Grandma hired a team of top-notch lawyers to help us navigate the complex process of emancipation and guardianship transfer. I'd naively thought that after being exposed, my parents would back down. I couldn't have been more wrong. Robert and Linda fought tooth and nail to maintain control over me, and by extension, their perceived access to Grandma's fortune. Our lawyers worked tirelessly, building a case that showed years of neglect and emotional abuse. The recording of my parents' conversation was damning evidence, but it wasn't the only weapon in our arsenal. Teachers from my old schools came forward, recounting how my parents had consistently missed parent-teacher conferences and school events. Mrs. Johnson, my third-grade teacher, testified about the time I'd won the spelling bee, and neither of my parents had shown up to see me receive my award. Neighbors spoke of the stark difference in how I was treated compared to Melissa. Mr. Rivera, who lived next door to us for years, told the court about the lavish birthday parties thrown for my sister while mine went uncelebrated. Then came the day of the final hearing. As we sat in the courtroom, waiting for the judge to arrive, I noticed a familiar face slip in through the back door. Melissa. When Melissa took the stand, her words shattered any remaining illusion of familial loyalty. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady. "I was aware of my parents' plan to use Cindy to access my grandmother's money." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I sat there, stunned, as Melissa continued. The sudden kindness, the sisterly bonding, it was all part of the act. Our parents thought it would be more convincing if I played along. Melissa's eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of remorse. But it was too little, too late. Her betrayal was the final nail in the coffin of my relationship with the Parkers. The judge's decision, when it came, was swift and unequivocal. Elizabeth was granted full guardianship, and I was legally emancipated from Robert and Linda Parker. As we left the courthouse, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of finally being free. Grandma wrapped her arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "It's over, sweetheart," she said softly. "You're safe now." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. It was over, yes. But it was also a beginning. A chance to build a life free from manipulation and conditional love. As we drove home, to our home, I gazed out the window, watching the familiar streets of my childhood pass by. I was leaving behind the family I was born into, but I was moving towards something far more valuable, a future built on genuine love, respect, and acceptance. As the dust settled from the legal battles and emotional upheavals, I found myself standing on the threshold of a new life. The mansion I now shared with Grandma was more than just a home, it was a sanctuary where I could finally breathe, grow, and heal. With the security and love I'd always craved now a constant in my life, I threw myself into my studies with renewed vigor. No longer was I trying to prove my worth to indifferent parents, instead, I was building a future on my own terms. Grandma Elizabeth, true to her word, dedicated herself to providing me with every opportunity she could. But more than the material comforts or expensive tutors, it was her unwavering support and love that made all the difference. "You can be anything you want to be, Cindy," she'd tell me, her eyes shining with pride. "The world is yours for the taking." Together, we embarked on adventures I'd never dared to imagine before. We traveled to Paris, where I fell in love with art and architecture. We went on safari in Africa, where I discovered a passion for wildlife photography. Each trip, each new experience, helped me discover facets of myself I never knew existed. But the journey wasn't all exotic locales and new hobbies. The hardest work happened in the quiet office of Dr. Larson, my therapist. Twice a week, I'd sit on her comfortable couch, slowly unpacking years of emotional trauma. "It's okay to be angry," she'd say gently. "It's okay to grieve for the family you should have had." Gradually, I learned to trust again, not just others, but myself. I began to see my own worth, to understand that I deserved love and respect simply for being who I am. As my high school graduation approached, I found myself reflecting on the tumultuous journey that had brought me to this point. The family I was born into was gone from my life, no cards, no calls, no contact. Mom, Dad, Melissa, they were now just characters in a painful chapter of my past. But in losing them, I'd gained something far more valuable. Self-respect, inner strength, and the unconditional love of a grandmother who had become more of a parent to me than my biological ones ever were. On the night before graduation, Grandma and I sat on the patio, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. "I'm so proud of you, Cindy," Grandma said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "You've overcome so much, and look at you now. You're stronger and more beautiful than ever." I felt tears prick at my eyes, but for once, they were tears of joy. "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma. You saved me." She shook her head, smiling. No, sweetheart. You saved yourself. I just gave you a safe place to do it. As I stood on the stage the next day, accepting my diploma to the sound of Grandma's enthusiastic cheers, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The pain of my past no longer defined me. Instead, I was filled with excitement for the bright future ahead. I may have lost the family I was born into, but I'd gained something far more precious, the freedom to become the person I was always meant to be. And as I looked out at the sea of faces, my eyes locked with Grandma's, I knew that whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it alone.